Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Cami Barry. I'm Associate Director here, and I just wanted to welcome you all today. Just a little housekeeping. Go ahead and turn off your cell phones. Okay. I also have two announcements. My first announcement is we have representatives from MDP Deals. This is an app that Lifelong Learning is now participating on. It's free. They're here to assist you if you'd like to download it on your smartphone. We send out notices about special events, upcoming lectures, also some coupons and special deals that we may have for lifelong learning students, and they're outside and they'll be there after class if you would like to stop by and ask them more questions. My second announcement is we are trying something a little new, and you are going to be our guinea pigs. We're going to do surveys on tablets today following the class. We're trying to go more green, so no more paper. We've tried online, but sometimes it's a little cumbersome to go on to the computer and to fill out the survey, and we want to catch you right after class. So we would really, really appreciate your help if you would stop by on your way after class. We have volunteers who will be holding iPads, and I think the majority of you know about iPads. It's very simple. It's very easy. There's like 5 questions. You just tap the button and you go on your merry way, and it's completely anonymous, so we will not have your name. So this is something that we're trying to do. It's very important that we get feedback from you about our classes and our instructors so that we can continue planning great programs. So I would really appreciate your help if you could stop by and fill out a survey for us, and our volunteers will be out there. I would now like to introduce Dr. Feinman, who's been here with us before, so I'm going to turn the class over to him. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you coming again today. I always like having an audience that's motivated to come, and so I do appreciate it. All right, today we're going to speak about one of the most colorful characters who has ever been president of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a man larger than life, many people would say, a man that could not easily be replaced in the sense of his impact on the country. His impact was positive and negative, which is not really that unique, but he's the kind of a person you can love and can also hate. And there's still a lot of passions around him, even now, 50 years after he became president of the United States by the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I think it is clear that Lyndon Johnson would never have been president if it had not been for the Kennedy assassination. He would never have been president if he had not accepted the vice presidency and unfortunately had to deal with the indignities of being vice president when the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, hated you and was determined to make you insignificant. All right, so the fact is, he was a Southerner from Texas. We had not elected a Southerner to the White House since Zachary Taylor in 1848. And we would not directly elect a Southerner to the White House until 1976, when Jimmy Carter became the first Southern president by election, originally in 128 years. All right, so Lyndon Johnson could only have become president in the circumstances he did. All right, now Lyndon Johnson, however, had an impact that is still affecting us today, both in domestic and in foreign policy. All right, Lyndon Johnson is a man born in Stonewall, Texas on August 27th, 1908. He grows up in a family whose background had been that relatives had been in the state legislature, so it sounds like a pretty good background. But actually, his family struggled a lot of the time. And when he finished high school, they could not afford to send him to a school that would be a leading school that he obviously would like to go to, a private university. Instead, he went to what was then called Southwest Texas State College. Southwest Texas State College. And for the rest of his life, he felt inferior that he had gone to a school that did not have, I guess what we would call a reputation. He always seemed to hate the idea of the Harvards, as he called them, the people who went to Harvard and Yale and other places, and who were the key people around John F. Kennedy. He didn't have an Ivy League education. He was not well-spoken. He was not a great orator. He was not exactly a handsome man. He was not a person that you would gravitate to by looking at him or listening to him. It was a tough act to follow John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was good-looking, charismatic, had a gorgeous family, which nobody else has really had quite that gorgeous a family since, as he had, and had a way about him, and his oratory was great. LBJ was not that way, but he had other strengths, other things that made him stand out. All right, and he had a vision that he wanted to make the country a better place for those who were not so fortunate. He was influenced by the New Deal of FDR. The point is this, that he had had an experience as a teacher of Mexican-American boys, I think 100 miles south of San Antonio, who were obviously poor, underprivileged. He had been teaching these, these Mexican-American boys, and had seen the poverty they went through, and it impacted him on the importance of fighting poverty and also of promoting education. And this was something in his blood from a young age. As early as 1931, after graduating Southwest Texas State College, he came to Washington, D.C. He was 23 years old. He became a staff member of a Texas congressman, and he would be spending the rest of his life until his retirement in Washington, D.C. So he came to the presidency with 32 years of D.C. experience. He had first worked, as I've said, as an aide to a congressman. Then he became the head of the National Youth Administration Texas chapter under FDR, and actually got to meet his hero, FDR, in 1937, when he's, I guess, what is he? He is 28 years old, and FDR visits, and he's looking up to him in an adulatory way, as if like almost you could sense he was saying, I want to be just like you. That is a treasured photograph, that picture of 28-year-old LBJ with Franklin D. Roosevelt, and having the vision that he wanted to do what FDR had done and go beyond what FDR had done with the New Deal. And it's really only one of two such photographs like that. The other, of course, which everybody pretty much knows, is Bill Clinton, 17 years old, Boys Nation, 1963, at the White House, shaking hands with John F. Kennedy, just, 5 months before Kennedy's death. And you can just see in his face, he's saying, I want to be just like you. And we didn't realize how much he would be like him in ways we don't want to discuss here right now. I don't know if you knew about that, but boy, he certainly did a very good job of copying him on that. Right now. In any case, LBJ was involved in the National Youth Administration to give college students the ability to have work-study programs, college time to be able to work and work their way through school in Texas. And he would expand that idea when he was president as part of his education programming. So he's very much involved in that. Now, then he runs for a seat in the House after having worked for a congressman, and he's a House member from 1937 through 1948. And in 48, he runs for the U.S. Senate and realized in Texas, when he was running for the House and when he was running for the Senate, what was the election? The primary. That's the only thing that mattered. There was no Republican Party in Texas, no Republican Party in the South after the Reconstruction era ended, 1877, until really the 1950s, late 50s, early 60s. All right, so this is, it's really a primary. So the primary is the key day. There is no opponent on Election Day. And his key opponent in 1948 for Congressman Johnson is a former governor, Coke Stevenson, not Adlai Stevenson, not as good as Adlai Stevenson, no way. Coke Stevenson, a traditional Southern Democrat, a segregationist, a person who certainly is not the kind of guy I would elect to office, but this is Texas in the Democratic Party in the 1940s. All right, now Johnson has his own connections with the oil industry. He's certainly no liberal at this point in any sense, but he's also a Washington, D.C. guy, while Coke Stevenson had been, in the past, the governor. And everybody sort of like knows in Texas politics historically, it's extremely corrupt. I'm not saying it's unique. Believe me, it's not. It's corrupt in Florida. It's corrupt in New Jersey. It's corrupt in West Virginia, particularly corrupt in Illinois. We know that, and elsewhere. But Texas certainly historically has been a champion of corruption. And everybody knew votes were going to be stolen. Votes were going to be manipulated. Votes were going to be created. So really, how would you ever know who won? That's the issue. Both sides were involved in this. Now, we don't say, and we don't know for sure, that LBJ or Coke Stevenson directly said steal votes, manipulate votes. Probably not. But you don't have to say it. All you have to do is smile at your aides and wink. That's all you have to do. They know. Your aides know what you're all about, whether your name is Chris Christie or Richard Nixon or anybody else. They know what you want. You don't tell it directly. Come on, let's be realistic. They know what you're all about. So LBJ, was he crooked? Yeah, of course he was. Was Coke Stevenson crooked? Of course he was. The question is, which would be better at being crooked? That's the key issue. All right, now, so the final votes come in after contested, and of course it's contested because it's very close. And at the end, it is decided by the official election commission, Lyndon Johnson has won the Senate seat over Coke Stevenson. And you'd say, all right, what kind of a margin? 10,000 votes maybe, which is pretty close in a state the size of Texas? No, much too much. 5,000 votes? No. 1,000 votes? No. 537 like George W. Bush in Florida? No, that's too much. Much too much. 87 votes in the state of Texas. Not 8,700, not 87,000, 87 votes. And it turns out in one particular district, it was shown that people voted in alphabetical order. What do you think of that? And they voted twice. Like in Chicago in 1960, Mayor Daley helping to win the state for Kennedy, 8,000 votes by having dead people come out of the cemetery to vote early and often. What do you think? I mean, come on. We've had corruption. Now, is it horrible? Yeah. I guess it all comes down to if you like the guy that wins, you don't really care how he got in. All right? I think that's what it comes down to. All right. Now, the point is that he wins by 87 votes. That is not the closest election ever, by the way, for a Senate seat. One time in New Hampshire, the winner won by 4 votes after a complete vote recount. 4 votes. So believe me, voting matters in midterm elections and in presidential elections. It really does matter. Every vote matters. It may not be close, but you don't know that. So I always tell my students, vote. You should all be voting because you have an impact by voting. If you don't, you have no right even to complain. Although people do anyway, but you don't have a right to complain if you don't vote. All right, so he gets a nickname he hates, Landslide Lyndon. He hates it. That's why by 64, when he runs and wins a landslide, he wants everybody's vote. He wanted 100% of the vote. He only got 61.2% of the vote, and he was upset. The old-time record, 61.2% of the vote over Barry Goldwater, because it wasn't enough. He couldn't believe that 38.8% of the people didn't love him. He couldn't understand that. And I'm not joking. He actually said things like that. He was disturbed. How can anybody vote for Goldwater, he was saying. How can anybody vote against me? Well, they could, but what a difference from 87 votes to millions of votes lead over your opponent. All right, that sort of like vindicated him. Now he was loved by the American people because he honestly had a lot of insecurities. He was a very insecure man. People have power and ego, and he certainly did have lots of insecurities. They just cover it up by the way they do things. And boy, did he do a good job of covering it up where you would never know he had insecurities. All right, now, so what we have is he's in the Senate, 1949, and he cozies up to the Southern Democratic leadership. The Southern Democrats are dominant in the Democratic Party. They were Northern Democrats, and they are for civil rights. Hubert Humphrey has just been elected to the Senate for Minnesota, and he's going to become a real pain in the rear end to Southern Democrats pushing for civil rights. But the point is the Southern Democrats get elected and reelected and reelected and reelected. Some of them from the 1920s on, they've been there, and this is 1948. Some will be there for 30, 40 years. They get seniority. They control committees. They have most of the real power whenever the Democrats control the Congress, and most of the time they will. And that's true with the House of Representatives as well. So, I mean, seniority matters, and it means Southern Democrats have an unusual amount of influence. So he realizes if he's going to go anywhere, he's got to cozy up to the leadership. And in the Senate, it is Richard Russell of Georgia, who is seen as the dean of the Southern Democrats. Richard Russell of Georgia, who he will later defy on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but that's years later, much later, and 15 years later. Now, he's going to cozy up and get so close to Russell and all that, get this, 2 years in, by 1951, he is going to become Senate Majority Whip, second figure in the Senate, below the Majority Leader. Imagine that. He's a freshman, 2 years, and he's Senate Majority Whip. He knows how to get things done. He knows how to know all the faults and the strengths of each of his fellow senators, particularly Southerners, but even others. And he's going to go out of his way, and he's going to become really, knowledgeable about everything about everybody, so that he can gain more influence. So 2 years in, he's Majority Whip. Then in 1953, 4 years in, the Republicans have won Congress under Eisenhower, and the Democrats are the minority now, but the Majority Leader has lost re-election. The former Majority Leader, who would have become the Minority Leader. So now in 53, still in his first term, Lyndon Johnson is the Minority Leader. Not majority, but he's the leader of the Democrats. He's moved up to the leadership, the Minority Leader. And then in 55, 54 midterm elections, the Democrats regain control. And now at age 47, he is the Majority Leader of the United States Senate. 1955, 56, 57, 58, 59, and 60, and he's going to be a whirlwind of action and activity. He's going to become easily, without any debate, nobody argues this, the greatest, most activist, most influential, most accomplished Senate Majority Leader in U.S. history. Nobody comes close. He is amazing. And if you're going to say who's near him, who's the second greatest ever Majority Leader, seriously, and it's not close, Bob Dole of Kansas, Republican in the 80s and the 90s. Certainly was very good, but he's not LBJ. Even he, who's still around, he's now going on 91. He still would himself admit he's not LBJ. No, he didn't have the personality of LBJ, Bob Dole, although he's a great American. But LBJ is the greatest. There's no way around it. And the thing is, he's working with the Republican president. We're seeing overlap. We're seeing people crossing the aisle. Democrats are working with the Republican president, and they're actually getting things done. Now, not on every issue. They fight on some. But we see action together. We see cooperation, not the polarization we have now, where the National Journal a week or two ago told us there isn't one overlapping person in either party now in the U.S. Senate. Every Democrat is more liberal, or the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican. In other words, and vice versa. In other words, they don't cross the aisle. Nobody cooperates. And I think in the House of Representatives, there were 2 members that overlap out of 435. And it used to be a few hundred would overlap, go over the aisle, cross the aisle. No more. That's why we got stalemate and gridlock. And it's not going to end. It's probably going to be worse in 2014. Changing the people doesn't change anything. It's the issue of how people work together. And they don't work together now. But under LBJ and Eisenhower, Republican president, Democratic Senate Majority Leader, and Sam Rayburn, the Democratic House Speaker, things got done from 55 to 60, including civil rights laws, the first since Reconstruction. 1957, weak ones, not big ones, but 57 and 60, we would get 2 civil rights laws, the first in 80 years or more, and we would have a Civil Rights Commission created and a Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department. And LBJ would shepherd this through, getting enough Northern Democrats and Northern and Western Republicans, and would fight against the Southern Democrats. But still, he was Majority Leader because he knew how to get things done. And he had as his key aide Bobby Baker, who would later be shown to be involved in corruption and would almost cause LBJ's downfall as a running mate for JFK in 1964. The argument is that if Kennedy had lived to be nominated again, he might have dumped LBJ because of the Bobby Baker scandal that erupted right around the time when Kennedy was killed. But, of course, then LBJ became president, so it wasn't an issue anymore, although it was an embarrassment about Bobby Baker. All right, now, so this is a man who's accomplished. He certainly is a leader. He and Hubert Humphrey really stick out. Stewart Symington of Missouri, Truman's favorite, sticks out. Adlai Stevenson, the 2-time candidate who lost, sticks out. They're all competing in 1960. But who's going to win it all? John F. Kennedy, who's by far less accomplished, less outstanding than Humphrey, Johnson, Symington, or Stevenson. But nobody ever said we get the best qualified or most experienced person to be in the White House. It doesn't work that way. All right, so Kennedy wins the nomination. Johnson doesn't even try to get involved in primaries. He figures he'll never win a northern primary, but he has the southern bloc behind him, the southern members of the Senate, the southern House members, those states which are important. They're needed to be able to have a Democratic majority. And when Kennedy wins the nomination, he's sort of like forced to ask LBJ to be his running mate, with everybody figuring, oh no, there's no way LBJ is going to give up majority leadership to be vice president. And this is before we knew that he would not be utilized much. It was just, why would he want to be vice president? You know, nobody wants to be vice president. After all, we had John Nance Garner, who was FDR's first 2 terms vice president, say the vice presidency wasn't worth a pitcher of warm spit. And actually, that's not the word. I'm being nice. I'll just say the word starts with P and ends in S, and it's 4 letters. That's actually what he said. But to say it nice, you say spit. All right. And Thomas Marshall, vice president under Woodrow Wilson, said, which isn't as bad, the vice presidency isn't worth a good 5-cent cigar. All right. That's not quite as funny, but who would want to be vice president? Nobody except Nixon earlier under Eisenhower had been influential at all. And Wallace a little bit under FDR, a little bit, Henry Wallace, 3rd term, and he got kicked off the ticket for being active. But seriously, the vice presidency was not an office anybody would strive for at that point. But LBJ takes it anyway, and Bobby Kennedy, the future attorney general, the brother of the future president, is furious, tries to get him to change his mind. He will not, and that starts their bad blood that continues for the next 8 years until Robert Kennedy himself is assassinated, seeking the presidency to follow Johnson in 1968. All right, the 2 men are like growling dogs. They cross each other's path. They do not like each other. And let's be honest, JFK did not use LBJ wisely. He did not give him any major assignments or influence. He didn't mistreat him. He didn't, show disrespect, but he did not do anything directly to give him real responsibility like Nixon had under Eisenhower. And yet this is a man of such importance. He should have been allowed to do more. He should have been allowed to be the liaison to Capitol Hill. Kennedy could not get things done on Capitol Hill, though Southern Democrats hated him. He's a liberal from Massachusetts. But if they had sent LBJ, maybe he would have been able to influence the Senate and the House Southerners. But nope, he didn't do so. That was a mistake on his part. So Johnson seemed almost like somebody you didn't need. He was excess baggage. And that's why people wondered in 63, would he be on the team for 64? And Kennedy was asked about this a few weeks before he got killed, and he said, yes, he will be on the team. But there were rumors that if the Bobby Baker scandal, which was about to erupt, came out, he might have to back away from LBJ. And that brings up the conspiracy theories. And there are 2 books out in the last year or 2 that claim LBJ was behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I do not believe that for a minute. Of course, I can't prove it. I am not a conspiracy theory believer. I believe the Warren Commission report myself. But there are 2 different authors separately who say that LBJ, in league with Texas oil men, who he was close to, and other interests, Southern segregationists and others, although he was going to promote civil rights, wanted to do Kennedy in. Now, there are a lot of groups that wanted to put the president down. Just like, let's be honest, there are a lot of people and groups that would like to put the president incumbent down. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It doesn't mean there's a conspiracy. I mean, there's always danger. The Secret Service is always kept busy back then and right up to now. It's nothing new about that. Constantly. It's a never-ending thing. It goes back a long time. Since at least FDR, there's been so many threats constantly against every president. No one has any clue exactly how many. Not everything is reported, but the ones we know are enough to make your hair stand on end, really, how close these things often come. So the point is, I don't believe that, but the point is, suddenly, on November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is in a motorcade in Dallas. LBJ is in the same motorcade, a few cars behind, and that's one of the reasons I don't see this as a likely thing, along with other factors. And he is knocked down and covered by his Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, at the time that Kennedy is shot. And he is not harmed, thank goodness. But that was a stupid thing to do, to allow the president and vice president the same motorcade. That is not a thing, as far as I know, that ever happens anymore. You don't put the president and vice president together ever in public again, except Inauguration Day, you have to, and it's always nerve-wracking. And the only other time, it's not really public, is that when the State of the Union address takes place, the vice president sits behind the president, but that's still inside the Capitol building. It's protected, so it's not the same. But realistically, the president and vice president should not be in public together anytime because of the danger involved. I mean, it just makes sense, but people weren't thinking that way 50 years ago. All right, so Johnson suddenly becomes president by 1 o'clock p.m. Dallas time, 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, when he's informed the president has died, and he's not going to take the oath of office instantly. First of all, the casket of John F. Kennedy must be delivered to Air Force One. He will not leave without it, and he will be sworn in on Air Force One by Sarah Hughes, a federal judge appointed by Kennedy at the recommendation of LBJ, a federal district judge, the first and only time a woman has sworn in a president of the United States, and of course the only time the president's been sworn in on a plane, Air Force One, and surrounded by his wife, Lady Bird. Actual name is Claudia, but he always called her a Lady Bird. It's a type of a bird, and he always said she's as pretty as a ladybird. Well, I don't know. I never thought ladybirds were that pretty, to be honest, but whatever. But that's what he said. Well, after Jacqueline Kennedy, nobody was pretty. Let's be honest. I mean, that's the problem. You're following such a gorgeous woman. How could anybody match up? Not that it matters. Lady Bird Johnson certainly spoke up, on issues. She was an activist first lady, a wonderful woman, and she lived to be 94, and she dedicated her life in many ways to doing good deeds. I mean, there's no way the Lady Bird was not significant. Actually, I'd say more significant than Jacqueline Kennedy, really, when you think about it. All right, but anyway, the point is Lady Bird was on one side and Jacqueline Kennedy wearing the suit with the blood of her husband on the other side, that famous or infamous, maybe, whatever you want to call it, photograph on Air Force One. And they go back to Washington, and Johnson makes it clear late in the afternoon, like at 5:36 at night, on November 22nd, 1963, he will do his best to carry on the tradition of John F. Kennedy. All right, now what we did not know until just about a year or two ago, and it's stunning and shocking, is, okay, that's the night of the assassination. Johnson is not in the White House that quickly, obviously not. He's at his own home. It's going to take a while till he moves into the White House, a few days. After all, it just happened. But the point is, the Secret Service men all over the property and all that, obviously there's no vice president now, and the Speaker of the House is next in line, and he's 73 years old and looks older, John W. McCormick, and the President pro tempore is 86, looks really old, scary. That's why we got the 25th Amendment shortly after, so we didn't have to have a long period without a vice president, a few months, but not a long period. Luckily, this was only a year and 2 months, however, of the term, so that's the latest in the term that ever happened. But you got to realize LBJ had a heart attack in 1955 at age 47. He was such a workaholic. His idea of work was all the time. He went to a football game, and he was talking about politics. He did anything, he was talking about politics. He didn't have any hobbies. As they said, he never went past page 1 of a book. He just read the title, and that was it. He was not a scholar. He was not a person who did anything other than politics. But he also was gross. This is a man who had beagle dogs, and he picked them up by their ears. And the ASPCA said that's cruelty to animals. He said, oh, no, they love it. How can you know what a dog loves? I like to know. Picking up dogs by their ears. And, hard to believe, he dictated, memorandums to his secretaries while sitting on the toilet. No joke. No joke. That's just beyond belief. He's gross. He also uses the N-word, not in public, but he was well known for using the N-word. And yet he did a lot on civil rights. He was crude. He had apparently a long-term love affair with a woman for 40 years, not one of these quick things like John F. Kennedy. And we only learned about it recently, and his wife must have known. And politicians' wives accept a lot. I don't know why they do, but they do, and some don't. The ones who don't, I really admire, because they shouldn't take any of this. It shouldn't be. All right, but a lot of this we didn't know, of course, then. He's far from perfect. But the point is, though, here he's a new president. He's had a heart attack. He almost died. He will eventually die of a heart attack in 1973. But you got to worry. The stress now, 8 years later, from 55 to 63, and 2 old men behind you, it's a little scary. And I was aware of it. I was in college, and I said, oh, my God, this guy had heart trouble. This is not a good thing. I would argue he shouldn't have been on the ticket because of it, but whatever. So the point is, he is unable to sleep. right after these events. He decides to walk out of his home for a stroll on his property. And, of course, the Secret Service is on the property. And suddenly one Secret Service man sees a shadow and sees somebody coming out or some kind of, rustling noise and draws his weapon. And Johnson comes around the side of it. And, the Secret Service man's about to shoot, thinking it's an intruder. And Johnson turns white as a ghost, according to the Secret Service book that just came out by retired Secret Service men, and backs away. But imagine if by goddamn chance he had actually gone ahead and shot the president, and we'd learned the next morning, the president was shot overnight by a Secret Service agent. And then I would have had a heart attack saying, President McCormick, 73 looking 80, and I'm not picking on old people, but Ronald Reagan looked young. John McCormick looked old, around the same age. It was maybe because he dyed his hair, Reagan. Maybe that was why. I don't know. He always looked young, Ronald Reagan. But John McCormick and Carl Hayden, no. I mean, imagine we could have lost a president overnight. Can you imagine that? Gosh, we never knew about it until recently, though. All right. So, but he turned white as a ghost according to the secret. I mean, it was a scary moment, So, all right. Anyway, so the point is that we're going to have the funeral of President Kennedy. And all that, he's going to certainly conduct himself very well, and it's going to be a very dignified period for a few days until the funeral. And then on November 27th, 2 days after the funeral, Wednesday, 5 days after, he speaks before Congress. And if you look at that video of it, you see McCormick and Hayden sitting behind him. And you say to yourself, please, Lyndon, do not get a heart attack and die on us. Please, please, pretty please, even if you don't think he's pretty. Pretty please. All right. Because it was scary. I mean, this is an amazing scene when you think of it. Nothing wrong with the men, but 73 and 86, no. And they had no visions of being president. All right, luckily he will be fine, but he has no vice president for the first year. But he makes it clear that Kennedy had talked about, let us begin, bringing change. He said, let us continue, was his famous line. Let us continue. And that's what he dedicates the next year. He's got less than a year to the election. The election will be November 3rd, and this is November 27th. And August is when the convention takes place. This is the latest ever somebody's become president in a term, and it's certainly going to be a time that he's got to make a record for himself to make sure that even though he's a Southerner and people didn't elect him, and a lot of people didn't like him personally, that he would get elected. All right? And people were thinking, geez, if Nelson Rockefeller becomes the nominee, he could actually beat him. I think unlikely, considering the circumstances of the tragedy, but I think he would have had a shot. But Barry Goldwater being nominated, that was a dream, because there was no way he was going to win in any way, and that was going to be a landslide. But we don't know that yet. So what happens is he sets 3 goals. First, and this, of course, you can't lose support when you do this, he called for what Kennedy had promoted but had not gotten done, a massive tax cut, a major tax cut. He said that we don't need as much tax money. That was a good, prosperous time. It made sense. The tax cut actually emboldened the economy and made it expand. That has not always happened, by the way. It's not always happened that tax cuts do a good thing. The fact is, it depends on the time. But tax cut is great politics, of course, just like a tax increase is bad politics. But other than that, he decides he's going to promote a war on poverty, an idea that Kennedy had thought about, had read Michael Harrington's The Other America. Johnson had read the cover, it was said. That was all. But he knew about it from JFK's aides, and he kept JFK's people on, including Robert Kennedy, until the summer of '64 when RFK ran for the U.S. Senate from New York, after he hoped he would be vice president under LBJ, and LBJ said, no way. So then he ran for the Senate and won the seat from New York. All right, now, so he begins the war on poverty, just beginning. We'll talk more about it in a few minutes. And then his big thing is the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had introduced in June 1963 and was said to be dead on arrival, that there was no way that the Southern Democrats and some conservative Republicans were going to vote for it, and there'd be a filibuster, and a filibuster to overcome, you had to get 67 votes, 2/3. 67 votes to overcome a filibuster. So 34 senators, mostly Southern Democrats, would be enough to stop it. All right, so he decides we're going to get this bill done. It's partly for Kennedy's reputation, and I'm going to show I can get this done. Here is a Southern Democrat who had fought the South on those civil rights bills in 57 and 60, had kept his leadership, had been respected, and was basically saying to Richard Russell and others, you're not going to stand in the way. We'll continue the filibuster. You want to continue the filibuster? We'll continue it until you wear down. We're going to overcome this. And ordinarily, a filibuster means, well, you're going to end up having the side that wants action give up on it. That's what usually happens. But Johnson says, no, we're not going to give up. We're going to stay here until hell freezes over, basically, is what he's saying. We're not going to give up, all right? And it's going to be the longest filibuster in U.S. Senate history, 83 days, 3 months, basically. And he's going to have dealings with these people in the White House. We're going to learn later on, not then, about the Johnson treatment, how he would get people on the Civil Rights Bill and the war on poverty and education and many other things and Medicare, get them to do what he wanted. What would he do? He would use FBI files on all of these members of Congress. Supposedly they all had skeletons in the closet, and he would let them know, I know of your skeletons, and they might come out if you don't help me out. That you could call blackmail, right? Yeah, so what? He got it done. I cannot imagine this president doing that, by the way. It's just not his style. I could not imagine Jimmy Carter doing it. LBJ, he could do it. As we say, he could cajole, persuade, charm. He could also threaten, blackmail. He could do it all depended on what you had to do. And therefore, the story was he'd invite people in to sit on one of his couches in the Oval Office, the couches that you sunk down in. No matter how big you were, you sunk to look very little. And he'd stand over you with his 6'4" frame, and he was a big guy, and he would put his head right next to yours, basically eyeball to eyeball, and push you to promote what he wanted. And it was said you could not easily say no to the Johnson treatment. And, of course, you could also tell people if they helped you, I'll help you get appointments to several commissions, like Everett Dirksen, the minority leader of the U.S. Senate, who wasn't for the Civil Rights Bill. But he told him, as we later learned, you want some appointments to this commission or to that judgeship, I'll help you if you get a few of your colleagues in your party to vote for the Civil Rights Bill, certainly to overcome the filibuster. I mean, once you overcome the filibuster, it doesn't matter at that point if you want to vote for the bill, because we'll have a majority. You just need to stop the filibuster. So he got enough Republican votes. He couldn't have done it without Everett Dirksen of Illinois. He got certainly, enough Northern Democrats, and he pressured a few Southern Democrats to back off and at least vote to end the filibuster. And then if you want to vote no, that kind of thing. Vote yes to have a vote, and then vote no on the actual legislation. It was a masterful thing. And Doris Kearns Goodwin well shows it, and Robert Caro well shows it. And I want to remind you about the sheet that all of you hopefully got of these major books. I mean, this guy was a wheeler dealer. That's the word for him. And he would be proud if he was here today to say, yes, I am a wheeler dealer. I get things done in a way that nobody had done since Franklin D. Roosevelt, and nobody has done as well since. All right, the man was amazing. He got the Civil Rights Act done. It was passed, signed into law July 2nd, 1964. It was the culmination of what Truman had called for, what Kennedy had called for, even what Eisenhower had backed. Now he's getting it, the idea of outlawing discrimination in education and public facilities, especially the public facilities, and in jobs. And, of course, it doesn't mean everything would be perfect overnight. There'd be lawsuits and delays and all kinds of barriers, but the U.S. government was standing up for civil rights, a massive law, now 50 years old, July 2nd. And just a couple of weeks ago at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, University of Texas area, the University of Texas campus, we had a civil rights summit, and we had speeches and all that about the 50-year anniversary of the Civil Rights Bill, and President Clinton was there, and President Carter was there, and President George W. Bush was there, and President Obama was there, and John Lewis, one of the few people left of the Martin Luther King crusade, Congressman Lewis of Georgia was there, and I saw a lot of it on C-SPAN, and I've been to the LBJ Library in the past, and somehow after seeing that summit, I said, boy, I was there in the year '05. I got to go back. So I think next year I'm going to go back to Texas. I'll go to the LBJ Library, and then I'll travel 100 miles to the George H.W. Bush Library. Since I love presidential libraries, I haven't been there, so I have an excuse. I can do 2 libraries on museums on one trip, and LBJ Library was great. When I went there, I got a bust of LBJ. and it's the largest bust I have of any president. That's LBJ. He has to sell busts even now that are larger than anybody else sells at any other library or museum. I swear, I have a bust of every president because I'm nutty. What can I say? I like that kind of thing. But his towers, and he would be proud. If he came to my house, he'd say, good man, good man. He would like it because he wanted to always stand above everybody because he has his insecurity. All right, he gets the Civil Rights Bill through, starts the war on poverty, and, of course, the tax cut. But Barry Goldwater is the nominee, and the Vietnam War issue is there, and Johnson is, of course, worried about it, and he hates the whole idea of foreign policy. It's often been said that he really didn't know how to spell the word foreign. He didn't know there was a G in it. All right, now, the fact is, he wanted to be a domestic president. I've often said, what did we really need in the 60s and the 70s? We needed a combination of presidents. We needed someone with the good looks and beautiful wife of John F. Kennedy, the domestic achievements of Johnson, the foreign policy accomplishments of Nixon, and the morality of Jimmy Carter, and the personality of Bill Clinton. How's that? That'd be great if you could just combine them all. I mean, seriously, but we never get the package, the whole package, do we? Unfortunately. All right, well, the fact is that we're going to have a very disputed incident that's still controversial today. I mean, the argument is Goldwater is talking about, well, we may have to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. A lot of people think, is he nuts? Nuclear weapons? Because of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacks on South Vietnam. We've had a disastrous situation with Ngo Dinh Diem assassinated in November '63, and the military generals take over, and it's very unsettled in South Vietnam. It's a real mess of a war. And Johnson comes in, and he decides we have to add troops quietly without us knowing. When Kennedy dies, there were 16,500 men, mostly special forces, the Green Berets, that are involved in search and destroy missions, but we don't hear much about it. And only 47 Americans have been killed. I mean, 47, but not many. Still too many. But Johnson quietly will add troops between then, November '63, and February '65, which is the month after his inauguration to the full term. He will have raised it from 16,500 to 27,000. And when you think about it, that's a two-thirds increase. 10,500 added to 16,500 is, it's not a lot, 27, but percentage it is. Two-thirds jump up there. All right, and meanwhile, the argument is, as we have now seen it, he felt he didn't look tough after what Goldwater was calling for. So in August 64, I should say, we're going to have the report of, and it's still contested today as to its validity and veracity, that we had North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, off of North and South Vietnam, attack American naval destroyers, the Turner Joy and the Maddox. All right, and then we've had different signals and different information that indicates there was no attack. Some people say it was misread. Some people think the military messed it up, or that maybe they purposely lied. And you'd say, the military lies? Come on, give me a break. Military lies a lot. I'm sorry, it's part of the deal of doing war or being involved in action overseas. You can't tell the whole truth. But others say, no, LBJ knew the truth. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It's still not 100% clear what he knew, but he's going to get blamed for it anyway in the long run. The fact is, the decision is that since they've been attacked, these U.S. naval ships, we have to respond by bombing Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, and Haiphong, the port city. We had never done bombing. Now we're going to bomb, only for a day or two, just to show them our air power. So we have him, Johnson, calling for a Gulf of Tonkin resolution to back the use of force. Actually, we're not going to war with troops into North Vietnam. You just want to bomb them, and he wants a resolution. His Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, who carried over from Kennedy, and McNamara, the same Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, are going to back him up on this and all that. And they're going to ask for a quick reaction by Congress. And at the time, I'm in college, and I'm thinking, this may really be an aggression, but my gosh, he doesn't even want to have a debate. He doesn't want a debate. He wants just a quick vote. And any time Congress rushes to do things without debate and formal discussion, you got to say it's something to worry about. It's not good to rush and be hectic and be in a hurry. Well, we have only about an hour or two of debate in the House of Representatives. And the final vote is 416-0. And the first thing I had is, what happened to the other 19? And some people say, well, they may have been in their office making love to some girlfriends, or who knows? Who knows? I mean, why didn't everybody vote, It'd be interesting to find out what happened to the other 19. But anyway, everybody voted yes. In the Senate, however, we had a temporary filibuster. Couldn't last. It was only 2 senators. But 2 senators did speak up, both Democrats, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Greening of Alaska. And they said, this smells bad. We want more information. And everybody else said, stop preventing a vote. Stop preventing a vote. And the final vote, it only could be held up a while, was 89-2. Which means 9 senators were not voting. Why, I don't know. But they are the 2 people we later would give credit to. They spoke up against the rush to do something. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passes. We bomb North Vietnam for a day and a half. It makes Johnson look tough. He refuses to debate Barry Goldwater in the campaign. After the 60 Kennedy-Nixon debates, Johnson does not want to debate. I can't blame him, because Goldwater was well-spoken. He might have done well in a debate against Johnson. But no, there'll be no debates. And, of course, the Johnson campaign is going to make Goldwater out to be an absolute monster, more than is fair, but that's politics. They're going to have that infamous commercial, one time only, but, of course, you see it on videos about LBJ, where you have a little girl with a medal picking petals of a flower, and suddenly you hear 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all the way down to 1, and you see a nuclear explosion behind her, and LBJ's voice saying, we must learn to love each other and coexist in the world, or else we will all die. Vote for Lyndon Johnson on November 3rd. Really nasty, very nasty. But it made Goldwater out to be a lunatic, all right? Now, was he? No. I guess I thought he was. I was part of the belief in propaganda. I remember going to an LBJ rally at Madison Square Garden and thinking Goldwater was a nightmare. Looking back now, I wouldn't have voted for him, but he wasn't a nightmare. He was a libertarian, actually. And he didn't, in later years, he didn't even like the Republican Party. He said they let religion come into the party. It should never be that way. Religion is separate. And I said, why am I agreeing with Barry Goldwater in his old age? Even Nixon I started to agree with at his old age, because he sounded better to me. All right. Anyway, the point is that he wins a landslide, but not every state. He loses 5 southern states. And this is unusual, Republican winning southern states. And the Southern Democrats tell Mr. President, you got your civil rights bill through, you're going to lose the South in the future. And it's true. The South was lost in future elections, except much of it went Democratic when Southern Democrats were the nominees, meaning Carter and Clinton. And only the first time Carter, not the second time, and Clinton. And Obama won a couple of southern states. But otherwise, the South became heavily Republican after the Civil Rights Act. And 5 of the states, the Deep South, went to Goldwater, along with Arizona, his home state. All right, so he actually won 52 electoral votes. So he didn't have the worst electoral vote defeat, but in percentage, he was the worst, because Johnson won 61.2% of the vote, surpassing FDR and Nixon later, and Warren G. Harding earlier, who had slightly less, but over 60%. Those are the 4 presidents, all of them second time, or full term, but not originally coming in, who had a greater victory, and Harding is a once and only time. All right, now, so Johnson has now a new vice president, Hubert Humphrey, and I always loved Humphrey. He was my favorite person when I was a kid. I think he's a great guy. Of course, he's gone now, but I loved Humphrey. But Humphrey was not going to be given a lot to do under Johnson. I mean, more than Johnson did under Kennedy. But really what Johnson wanted from Humphrey is to become a spokesman for the Vietnam War escalation that was about to occur and would occur. And Humphrey was uncomfortable, but Johnson, as we now know, told him, if you don't back me, I will not invite you to cabinet meetings, and you will have no influence at all. So Humphrey became a hawk, H-A-W-K, on the war, even though he was really secretly a dove. And he hated being vice president because you can't be your own man. You really can't. I mean, only Aaron Burr could be his own man under Thomas Jefferson and, be alienated from Jefferson. And Calhoun under Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams could be, but that's way back. But a vice president must basically go along with the president, and it ties you down. You're going to be blamed for everything that goes badly and probably won't get credit for what goes well. So Humphrey was not happy in the vice presidency, but He would run for president in '68 against Nixon and George Wallace, and of course would lose in a close race. And I haven't recovered from it yet after all these years, because I wanted Humphrey. I really did. Even though he wasn't perfect, my friend said to me, Humphrey supports the war. I said, no, I don't think he really does. He's doing what he has to do. Well, I can't vote for him. I'm going to vote for Nixon. He has a secret plan to end the war. I said, yeah, but it's secret. You believe him? Tricky Dick? 10 years later, Nixon told David Frost, and he laughed, oh, that was just a way to get campaign votes. And I turned to my friends and said, now who's the smart one here? Wink, wink. You should have voted for Humphrey, that kind of thing. I like to try to get back when somebody's shown wrong. All right, now, just for fun. All right, now, so anyway, Humphrey will not have a major role, but he's the vice president. And I thought, well, if anything happens to Johnson, we have a good man in there. It's better than John W. McCormick or Carl Hayden, certainly. All right, now, so we have the full term now, and he now enunciates much more what he wants to do, the Great Society. He wants to complete the New Deal. He refers to the New Deal. He wants to go way beyond what FDR had done, which had a dramatic effect on us. So we're going to see the war on poverty expanded. It's already started in '64. And we're going to have Sergeant Shriver, the brother-in-law of President Kennedy, who had been the head of the Peace Corps, is made right from the beginning in '64. See, that's a different thing. Sergeant Shriver and LBJ get along. RFK and LBJ do not. But Sergeant Shriver works for LBJ, the war on poverty, and we get, indeed, all the programs of the war on poverty. We're going to have Model Cities as one of the programs. The Job Corps is another. Project Head Start is another. Now, there's varying amounts of success with these. Nobody said everything works out perfectly. And it's a kind of a game you can play about was it successful or not. It depends how you want to look at it. If you want to say that there were some people who benefited from the war on poverty, and they certainly were, then it was good. If you're looking for a very high, like 70, 80% success ratio, then you're going to find fault with it. But the argument is if anybody's life is improved, it is better. And there were people trained for jobs. There were kids who got education before elementary school and went on to be great successes because of Project Head Start. There were areas that were rebuilt slums, and they stayed well. They stayed in good shape. Others didn't. So it's like anything. The war on poverty spent $5 billion. Well, we were escalating the war in Vietnam, and over time spending $100 billion. And the argument was if we'd only spend more on poverty, it would have helped. And it would have. And honestly, there's been no real major push to deal with poverty since on the level of the war on poverty. And it could have continued under Nixon, but he actually cut back on it. If Humphrey had come in, it would have expanded. And I believe it would have been much better. But still, the figures show poverty had been, indeed, 18% of the country, according to statistics. So, of course, you can lie with statistics, I guess. It went down to 12% by 1968. And the argument is it would have gone down further, percentage-wise, if it had been continued. Instead, today, it's about 18% today. And nobody's really talking about poor people. They talk about middle class. You don't hear much about poor people. There's always middle class, which is fine, but it's like poor people don't exist, and that they do. All right, so the war on poverty, not fantastic success in the sense it doesn't solve the issue, but it makes life better for many. It gives hope. It gives a sense of a future to many that benefit from it. But not everybody does, of course. But in any situation, not everybody does. Now, we also get a greatly expanded federal aid to education. We had the National Defense Education Act under Eisenhower that began it in 1958 after Sputnik. Kennedy could not improve it because the Southern Democrats didn't want to have any more educational funding. They said, let us run our own schools. They didn't want to have federal intervention. But under Johnson, we get a massive increase in the National Defense Education Act. And part of it is the promotion of giving outstanding students the opportunity to go on for graduate degrees all the way up to a PhD and become college professors. Fellowships were given. And when that was first passed, I didn't think much about it, except, gee, it sounds good. And then, very luckily and fortunately, I became a recipient of a National Defense Education Act Graduate Fellowship, Title IV, which indeed allowed me to not teach in high school, which I already gotten a job, but to go on and do full-time study for the doctorate in history. and indeed be supplemented by monthly stipends and free tuition. And I look back, and it's a long time ago now, 1967, and I say to myself, if I had not had that, would I have ever actually finished? I would have started maybe. Would I have ever finished a doctorate? Would I have ever had a 42-year college career, which I've had since 1972 of teaching in the college level? And I have to say, if for nothing else, I thank LBJ for that. Not personally so much, but it was his administration that brought it about. And I came out of school, undergraduate school, at the right time, and I was lucky to have that chance and to take advantage of it. And I remember asking my parents, should I do this? I had a teaching job. I just gotten offered on the North Shore of Long Island. And they said, look, you got this job without it. Let's say you don't finish. You're still going to be benefited by more education, and you can certainly get a job later. Don't turn down any opportunity when someone's offering you financial support. So I did it, and I'm glad I did. And I'm proud of the fact that I've done it for this long. And I may be retired, in quotes, officially, but I'm still teaching, still lecturing, and I intend to do it until I'm 99. Not 100, only 99. 99 is it. At 99, I'm saying goodbye, that's it. But that means I've got another 30 years to go. I want to set all-time records of how many years. 72 years. How's that for teaching? That sounds good, doesn't it? 72 years. 42 and counting. All right, now, so education, fantastic. I mean, how can you find fault with it? The war on poverty. Then we have Medicare. Kennedy could not get it done. Truman had talked about it. Nothing ever happened. Kennedy could not get it done. Wilbur Mills stood in the way, head of the Ways and Means Committee from Arkansas. He had been there since Noah's time, it seemed. You know, it was unbelievable. And he wasn't bending. However, Johnson got him to bend. And we wondered, how did he do it? In 65, we get Medicare. Never fully understood why. And then about 10 years later, I figured it out. Oh, my God. Wow. Remember what I said about FBI files and so like, you know, bribing and blackmailing people? We didn't know. Of course not. It was kept secret. In I think it was 75 or 76. Wilbur Mills is still there. He's still there. And he gets involved in a drunk driving accident right near the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And we hear, oh, he had an accident. Oh, my God. And he's like 75 years old. He had an accident. He's drunk driving. I mean, that's bad enough. But we then heard there was a woman in the car with him. And I said, oh, my God, Mrs. Mills, I hope she's all right. No, it's not Mrs. Mills. It's Fannie Fox, 25, a stripper. And when I heard that, I laughed and said, now I know how Medicare came about. But I don't know if anybody else would have done what LBJ did. I'm sure we don't know. I don't know for sure in the sense of 100% proof, but come on. You put 2 and 2 together and it's 4, or is it 5, whatever. The new math may make it 5, whatever. The point is that, imagine that. So you got to say, if he's 75 and he's doing this, he suddenly did it at 75? You believe that? I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you, even if it's not for sale. All right, now, so imagine we got Medicare. All right, it's amazing. All right, and my mother benefited from Medicare. She had heart surgery at 80, and we could not have afforded it. And she lived another 4 years. And you know, of course, even if it doesn't affect you personally, how can anybody really say we should not be supportive of Medicare? It's almost 50 years. Next year it'll be 50 years. It's amazing. And of course, it's a cost issue. I understand that. Everything is a cost issue. But the answer is, you do what you have to do, and if you have to raise taxes to cover it, you cover it. That's all. You don't decide to defy and say, well, people should just die, or we're just not going to do it, or we're going to privatize it. No, it is not to be privatized. It will not be anyway. But it's 50 years next year. So an amazing thing when you think about it. All right, now, so we get Medicare, we get education, the war on poverty. All right, now, and the Civil Rights Bill. And then we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the year after the Civil Rights Act, because we have the march from Selma to Montgomery, and we have bloodshed in Alabama, Martin Luther King and others, you know, and people killed on the march from Selma to Montgomery. And we're going to have, indeed, Johnson invite Governor George Wallace to the White House. And indeed, get him to agree that the National Guard should come in to escort people safely for the next week's march after Bloody Sunday had occurred. And it's a funny story how George Wallace came to the White House, and he's a short little guy, about 5'5", and he sits down on one of the couches and sinks really deep in it. because and then Johnson, 6'4", he's over him. And as later it was said, not publicly, but he said privately, he said, if it had not been for me leaving when I did, George Wallace said, he would have had me coming out for civil rights. Because Johnson could make people do what he wanted. So we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that changed the South because it revolutionized politics. It got African Americans able to vote again after 70 years or more of not being able to vote. And it also started to make what we call the New South. And we had New South politicians, people who did not run on racial segregation lines. And we get New South governors in the 1970s, and in 1971, a few of them are indeed portrayed in an issue of Time magazine, that they are the New South governors. They don't have a racial past. They didn't use the issue. And who are these people? Governor Dale Bumpers of Arkansas, who later goes to the U.S. Senate, good senator, good governor, and later is followed by Bill Clinton, later years, and also Governor Reuben Askew of Florida, the best governor in Florida history, one of the top 10 governors of all time in the history of the United States, who just died recently, Reuben Askew, and a smiling guy who I noticed, boy, what a brilliant smile he has, Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia. And if somebody had said, you see that face in 71? He's going to be president in 6 years. Yeah, oh, sure, yeah. But he was. Although once he became president, he stopped smiling as much. I have to admit that. Wasn't a lot to smile about. But I used to watch Jimmy Carter smile when he was running and saying, how does he smile and speak clearly? I tried in the mirror and I can't do it. I'm not going to show you. But I tried to smile and talk. I look ridiculous, So this is not comedy, so I'm not going to do it. But he had a way to do it. His mouth was different. But again, there wasn't as much smiling when the problems came down on him, which, let's face it, it's a tough job for anybody. All right, but the New South came about, and even the Old South started to change. I mean, not right away. George Wallace was running in 68, of course, still a segregationist. 72 was shot down by Arthur Bremer. I have a chapter in my forthcoming book on assassinations and threats on Wallace and Bremer. But after that, he reforms. Boy, does that change his view of life, and he becomes a civil rights supporter and apologizes and asks for forgiveness in his later life. George Wallace, he says he wants to go to heaven, not hell. I guess he figures that the Ku Klux Klan is in hell, and he doesn't want to be there, so he wants to be in heaven. I wonder, is he in heaven? I'll find out one day. I guess we all will. I hope he isn't, actually. All right, but anyway, the point is George Wallace and also Strom Thurmond. Oh, my gosh, the original Mr. Segregationist of 1948. He starts hiring blacks to be part of his office staff. He changes his views somewhat because he realizes he has to have black voters out there. He has to get their support. So he really sort of like reforms a bit. Not completely, but reforms a bit. So the South is transformed by the Voting Rights Act. Now, so we have all these things, but we have more than this, more than civil rights and voting rights, more than education, more than health care, more than the war on poverty. We have so many other things. We have immigration reform, where we now are changing the immigration laws and allowing people from Latin America and Asia to come in, and they'd always been barred before. And it changes in 1965. We also have the first environmental protection laws, first laws on the environment, on air and water pollution under Lyndon Johnson. We have the first consumer protection laws, which are very important and become a trend for the future. We also have PBS created, PBS, and National Public Radio created. We have the National Endowment for the Arts created, the National Endowment for the Humanities created. I mean, so much is going on. He appoints the first African-American Associate Justice, Thurgood Marshall, who stays on the court for 24 years. He appoints the first black cabinet member, Robert Weaver, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He does get 2 new cabinet agencies, Housing and Urban Development and Transportation. I mean, the guy accomplishes more domestically than anyone since FDR. And if you look at history and say domestic accomplishments, the top 3 and accomplishments that still affect us today, I still would say FDR is first, but not by much. LBJ is second, and Woodrow Wilson, further back, is third as far as the most domestic accomplishments. Things that Wilson did are still with us today, Johnson did, and FDR did. Whether good or bad, whether you like it or not, Our country is so much based on what Wilson, in a lesser sense, FDR in a massive sense, and LBJ in almost as much or maybe more massive sense brought about. All right, so if we were only judging LBJ by domestic, he'd be in the top 5. But it's not just that. It's foreign policy, and that's the problem. The Vietnam War is going to be escalated. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to handle foreign affairs. He's added troops up to 27,000, as I've said, by February 65. Now, as we add more troops, there are more attacks on the troops, of course. And it's not a joke. The Gulf of Tonkin may have been made up, but in February 65 at Pleiku, Pleiku, there's a serious attack on U.S. Marines. And for the first time, I believe, in the war, we have double-digit losses, meaning more than a few, like 10 or more. And now we have Johnson starting sustained bombing of North Vietnam, Hanoi, the capital, Haiphong, the military center, the port city and military center, also of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. And we have, of course, defoliant, Agent Orange being used, napalm being used, etc., doing tremendous environmental damage over time. And it's going to start to really become an issue because the draft, which has always existed, is increasing. And it's not just people who volunteer or career people. We have draftees going, and we start having an anti-war movement in 1965. And we have hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, headed by J. William Fulbright of Arkansas. And Dean Rusk is sitting there smoking his cigarette. And it's disgusts me because I don't like smoking and thinking, what an example for the country. But in 65, nobody thought much about smoking, although we already knew it caused lung cancer. But he's sitting there arrogant, and he's saying, Senator, we don't need any further backing for military action. You gave it to us last year in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It's open-ended. That's all we need. Boy, did that turn the Democrats into a split party. We had those who supported Johnson, those who did not. And meanwhile, our troop level went up, and our casualty level, of course, went up. And just give you some round numbers. Here we have, when Kennedy died, 16,500 men in Vietnam. By February 65, it's 27,000. That's where we start. Now, that's February 65. Let's go to December 65, okay? 10 months later. 27,000 in February. What is it in December? 190,000. 7 times as much. 27 times 7 is 189. That's the end of the year. By the end of 66, it's doubled to 400,000. That's 15 times what it was in February 65, a year and 10 months earlier. Then 67 goes by, keep on adding troops, more casualties, and in March 68, we reach an all-time high, 549,500 men, and General William Westmoreland is saying, we don't have quite enough, we need more troops. And that is when the additions are going to stop. And by the way, it's 549,500, not 550. And you might say, why are you so exact? Because I was eligible for the draft. I was in graduate school, however, and I paid attention to the numbers, and it was 549, 500. I think it was thought, if you say 550, it sounds bad. It's better to have it a little less, like $2.99 instead of $3 for something, right? It sounds better. So it's 549, 500. All right. Now, the fact is that our casualties were going up. By the time Johnson left office, over 25,000 Americans have been killed, and many, many more, probably a couple 100,000, at least 100,000 wounded. I mean, we never talk about wounded. We never talk about figures like that. It's always the ones who die, which I understand, but those who were wounded mentally, physically, or otherwise, it's just amazing. All right, now, the fact is the country was badly split, and it wasn't partisan. There were Republicans who were hawkish, supporting the war. There were Democrats who were hawkish, but there also were Democrats and Republicans who were dovish, those against the war. So we have, for instance, among Republicans, as examples, we have Mark Hatfield of Oregon, Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon, Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky were against the war. Democrats included George McGovern of South Dakota, who later would run in 1972 for president, also ran in 68 after RFK was killed, but didn't become the nominee. Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, who challenged Johnson in 68. I think Humphrey would have been if he hadn't been vice president, but he couldn't be. And, of course, Robert Kennedy became a critic of the war. And, of course, many, many others. J. William Fulbright of Arkansas, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was another. All right, so, and that's just giving a few examples. But, I mean, it divides the country. Johnson cannot go anywhere to speak without anti-war demonstrations and people saying, LBJ, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? Because we had all kinds of war correspondents live from Vietnam with the satellite program. And by the way, the space program was still being developed. That's another thing occurring under Johnson. Okay, but we have the space satellites and all that. We have live coverage from Vietnam by Morley Safer and Dan Rather and many other war correspondents, from different stations. And we have the video of the young girl being hit by napalm and screaming and yelling and running almost naked. The clothes were burned off her. She came to the United States and had so many surgeries, years ago. We saw images of what happened to My Lai. Well, that came later. My Lai, we didn't learn about My Lai massacre until later, but that was happening during Johnson's time. It was a really divisive time, a very divisive time. And, the opposition to the war was so great in his party, the Democratic Party, that Johnson was losing public support. Now, while this is going on, I want to just mention there are other events, and that's going to cause him trouble too. He decides that the Dominican Republic's new president is too leftist because Fidel Castro of Cuba is at his inauguration. So in 1965, the United States invades the Dominican Republic to overthrow Juan Bosch, B-O-S-C-H, and causes Latin America to turn against us. And under Kennedy, there'd been really a good feeling, other than for Cuba directly. But here that we're intervening in the Dominican Republic, and we withdraw within a year. All right, and Johnson's trying to promote the end of the war in Vietnam by meeting with Kosygin, the Soviet leader, at Glassboro State College in Glassboro, New Jersey, now known as Rowan College, R-O-W-A-N, and nothing works out of that. I mean, he does meet him, looks good, but he looks awkward, in doing it. And by the way, he gives him a bust of himself. That's the gift. Everywhere he goes, he gives busts of himself, LBJ. When he was vice president, he went to India. I saw a video, and he gives busts to everybody, of himself. That's what you give as a gift when you go to another country? A bust of yourself? The man was strange in some ways, but he was also extremely able to accomplish many things. But he's a complicated guy. He really is. Fascinating. He really is. All right, we also have the Middle East War of 1967, the Six-Day War. And out of that, Robert Kennedy will be assassinated because of his support of that by Sirhan exactly a year later. But we, of course, almost have conflict with the Soviet Union over that. So that's another issue. All right. And we also have the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 when he's really a lame duck president. What can we do about it? The Soviets take over Czechoslovakia, which had been having a liberal spring, as they call it. A little like what's going on in Ukraine now. What are we going to do? It's their area. It's impossible to do much militarily about it. And people forget, North Korea, under grandpa of Kim Jong-un, in 1968 seized a naval ship, the Pueblo, January 68, and kept, I think it was 82 hostages until December, and only gave them up and kept the ship. It's still in North Korean hands, kept the ship, but released them after apologies were arranged, which would then, of course, repudiated. But otherwise, they might still have been there. But North Korea's dictator seized these people. The Pueblo became an incident. It was the year of the election. You know what it comes down to? Czechoslovakia is intervened in. We can't do anything about that. North Korea seizes the Pueblo. We're going to have, of course, the Tet Offensive at the end of January going to February, attacks on South Vietnamese cities, which turns a lot of people to say, let's get out of this war. Everything is going bad. Why? It's the it's the full term of Johnson, and, almost like a second term, although he only had a year of the first. And things go downhill. Once you're elected by a landslide, everything is downhill. Or even when you're elected by a close race, to be able to stay high and successful is very difficult as the years go by, as your power wanes because everybody knows you're leaving. Now, we didn't know he was leaving until he announced on March 31st, 1968, that he was not going to run for another term as your president because he could have run. He only had a year and 2 months under the 22nd Amendment. With less than 2 years of the term, he could have been president for another 4 years. I think that was his intention. But he decided, because of the split on the war, and he wanted to try to bring peace, which he could not bring about, unfortunately, by negotiations. He decided to withdraw. So he withdraws, and the battle for the Democratic nomination becomes one of Humphrey, Robert Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, and then when Kennedy is murdered, and he probably would have been the nominee, George McGovern replaces him, but Humphrey ends up the nominee, but it's a split Democratic Party, and George Wallace runs as a third-party candidate and does very well, second best in history, to Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Party campaign. And coming out of the woodwork is Nixon, saying he's a new Nixon. And we thought, I said, new Nixon? He's 55 now. Are you different at 55 than you are at 47? Not really. But he said, I've changed. And I thought, yeah, probably for the worst. All right, and I could not, but I said, there's no way he's going to win. But he did. Of course, he wouldn't debate Humphrey. And he was scared and thought if Kennedy had lived, he wasn't going to debate after 1960. It was miraculous. He came back, and he said he was going to bring us together. And maybe another time we can talk about Nixon. He didn't bring us together. He could have. I've often looked back and thought if Nixon had won in 60, he might have been a better president and a much more successful one. I think by the time he got in, he was bitter, and he was paranoid about how he had been defeated and saw people as enemies, not opponents. And I think it's sad because Nixon had a lot of brilliance and was quite a genius in many ways. But he had his issues. Well, the point is Johnson decides he's not going to run, so he's a lame duck president. After negotiations and meetings with his staff and his foreign policy and military people, he announces a halt to the bombing and beginning of peace negotiations and says he's not going to run. And the year wears out, and of course, he's coming up to the end of his time. And he's there for the inauguration, January 20th, 1969, and he looks worn out, like it's time to go home to Texas. And he goes home, and he goes into depression. He always smoked. Much too much smoked. He never stopped smoking. He drank more. He grew his hair long, which is amazing. He used to criticize the hippies. Toward the end of his life, he looked like a hippie somewhat. He had long hair, and he was in depression. And his last public appearance was 6 weeks before his death when he held a summit on the civil rights law, and his own library had just opened recently, and he looks bad, and he goes home. And the second inauguration of Nixon comes up, and he's invited. The only living president, Harry Truman, had died in December 72. This is January 73. He dies 2 days after the second inauguration. Two presidents dying within a month of each other, Truman and LBJ. And the thing is, he didn't go to the inauguration. Why? He didn't feel well. He didn't show up. There was no former president at the inauguration. I think the only time in modern history. And 2 days later, he had a heart attack. He grabbed a phone, called for help. By the time they got to him, he was gone. He had died of a heart attack 18 years after his original heart attack. Thank goodness it was out of office, that it didn't happen in 63 when he had that gun pointed at him, by the Secret Service, or just the idea of, oh my God, I'm president. Thank goodness for that. Now, his reputation would go downhill. It would decline rapidly over Vietnam, and many people still hate him with a passion for the Vietnam War and what he did with that and the deception it is felt that occurred and everything else. Others would say, well, yes, I certainly wasn't thrilled about his war policy, and his diplomacy basically wasn't very good anyway. Overall, like the invasion of the Dominican Republic was a mistake, I think. But the domestic record, how could you avoid that? And me, being a recipient of the National Defense Fellowship, I had to sort of feel he was good in some ways. I mean, everybody has their ups and downs. But he was rated low. He has crept up. And in the most recent C-SPAN poll of experts, he is rated number 11, just outside the top 10. Now, I would rate him higher myself. I, first of all, would rate him above Kennedy. Forget about Kennedy's looks and his oratory and how he died, and even the Cuban Missile Crisis. As far as pure accomplishment, I would put LBJ a little above Kennedy, but he's not. But I think he will eventually hit the top 10. And if you could somehow wipe out 7 letters, Vietnam, and you can't, he would probably be, if he had not had that, he might have been number 5 or 6, because he really is an exceptional leader. Had his faults, had his shortcomings, obviously, but he's a man that had a great impact on our history, and we cannot fully understand our history unless we understand the role of Lyndon Baines Johnson. 1908, August 27th, 1908, to January 22, 1973. and therefore 64 years of age, not yet 65, and therefore not eligible for Medicare. Like FDR was not eligible for Social Security. He was 63 when he died. Not that he needed it, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's ironic that he wasn't the age to get Medicare. All right, so I thank all of you for coming, and I welcome questions and comments. Thank you. Thank you. And I will make sure I repeat the question. I think I forgot a little last time, but I will repeat the question so everybody can hear it. So anybody who has any questions? Yes. Yes, go ahead. Okay, the question is, in your voting lifetime, who was your favorite president to vote for? Well, the problem is I could not vote for Lyndon Johnson. I would have. I was at that Johnson rally because I was not yet 21. So I only had a choice from 1968 on. And honestly, I wasn't terribly, I wasn't terribly happy about who won the elections most of the time. To be honest, in 1976, I was not a big Jimmy Carter fan. I voted for him, but I sort of like had to get used to him. I wasn't all that big a fan of Bill Clinton either because I thought he was a slime ball with his love life, and that bothered me. So actually, the favorite president or favorite person I voted, well, actually, is it a question of the one who won or just my favorite person who might have lost? Which do you want? Okay, president, I'd have to say Barack Obama. I was very thrilled to vote for. Now, if I'm going to say for a person that did not win, it would be Hubert Humphrey, 1968. And right behind him would be George McGovern, 1972. Carter, not as much. Mondale was all right. Dukakis, who I actually met, not particularly enthused. Gore I liked, but I'd say Humphrey for the loser and Obama for the winner. Is what I would answer. I really wanted Humphrey. Okay, thank you for your question. Okay, in the back, and then I'll get the person in the front. First. Okay, Humphrey in the last days or couple of weeks of the 68 campaign came out more against the Vietnam War policy of LBJ, and the question is, could he have maybe won if he had come out and broken, I guess you called, with the administration earlier? I think he might have, but actually we now know that Johnson was furious at Humphrey doing this and actually was hoping Nixon would win. That's how upset he was. But I think Humphrey, being around Johnson, you were like intimidated. Johnson's an intimidating guy, and I think he was a little afraid to speak up, but he finally did in desperation. But I do think he might have won because it was close. I think he might have been able to swing things because a lot of people did not want to vote for Humphrey because he was the hawk when he really wasn't. And so that's why they stayed home or they voted, for third-party candidates or whatever. I think it might have helped, yes. But, you could say he didn't have enough courage, I guess. It's a tough situation. Just like Al Gore. Should he have utilized Bill Clinton in 2000 more? Maybe, but he didn't want to because of Clinton's bad image. But then later people thought, of course he did win the national vote, but maybe it would have been different in Arkansas and Louisiana, or Tennessee, Arkansas and Tennessee, he lost, if he had had Clinton, especially in Arkansas. Yes? Okay, what was the thought process of Johnson deciding to take the vice presidency and stepping down, in a sense, from the Senate majority leadership? Well, if you go by these recent books, it's because he's plotting to kill Kennedy, which I don't believe. I think that part of it is, let's face it, if you are vice president, and he may have known about the zero election year syndrome, you may have heard of. Every president elected in a 0 year, 1840, 1860, 80, 1900, 20, 40, and 60, all died in, 60 we didn't know yet, all died in office. Maybe he thought natural causes that he might die. 1980, Reagan was shot after, so he was sort of like a victim. And even in 2001, George W. Bush was threatened in theory, on 9/11. So you could say zero election year syndrome threat exists even now. Not that it's science, but I think it might have been the thought, well, we have had 7 vice presidents who became president and by succession, and that, not talking about the ones who got in by election, only a few have. And maybe he just figured, who knows? But I don't know. Maybe also was a moment of feeling that Kennedy was not experienced enough and he needed my guidance, my expertise, which he had. But then Kennedy didn't use it. That's his mistake. He should have used him and told his brother, Bobby, shut up. He wasn't good at telling his brother to shut up. And Bobby was good, and he was a pain in the rear end. Even his brother said that. I've read that John Kennedy would say, my brother's a pain in the, and he didn't say rear end, he said the A word. But yet, he was brother, and there's the blood thing. But I think Bobby was good, and he was also destructive at times. I think he was a complex figure, let's say. Okay, and yes. Say that again? I'm sorry. Oh, the 6 people here? Well, that's difficult. I would say, well, of course, the most detailed is Caro, because that's 4 volumes. But I think really the original one, Doris Kearns Goodwin, who was an aide to him in his retirement years and wrote the first book on him and really got to know him. I think Doris Kearns Goodwin's Lyndon Johnson, American Dream, and of course she's gone on to write about the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, and Teddy Roosevelt now, this new book on Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and Lincoln. I mean, the woman's amazing, But I would say probably that one. But as far as detail, obviously Caro and Dalek are much more, space than the others. I think they're all good, though, but I would probably say Doris Kearns Goodwin, who when she comes to speak anywhere, she convinces you she was there. She was there with Lincoln. She was there, she's, that kind of a thing. I mean, you really say, God, you look good for your age. You really do, So, but she is a brilliant speaker. She really is. She is exceptional, and I admire her. And I aspire to be as good as her, if I could be, because she's really good. So anyway, any other questions? Yes, okay. First, the person in front, then the one behind. Yes. Well, the question is whether the Warren Commission was a whitewash. I'm not an expert on that, although I'm briefly writing about it in the Kennedy chapter of what my future book is. There were problems with the Warren Commission, but as I think I said when I talked about JFK 3 weeks ago, and again, I'm not an expert on it personally, Vincent Bugliosi, and particularly him, and Gerald Posner rip apart every conspiracy theory and back the Warren Commission. And again, I'm not the experts, they are. But I would say there are mistakes made, but I look at that commission and I do not see Chief Justice Warren, who I really respect a lot, as being someone who was involved in a whitewash knowingly. Now, maybe it wasn't knowingly, that kind of a thing. But there were mistakes made, and I think one of the problems was because maybe it was done too quickly where it was rushed to be before the election. Maybe it should have been a couple of years investigation, but everybody wanted to have a quick response. So I guess more could have been done, but I don't know. I mean, again, I would just tend to respect Bugliosi and Gerald Posner and think that there are mistakes made, but I don't see it as necessarily a whitewash, but I don't claim to be an expert on it. You want to follow up and then, okay, done quickly, and I got to get to the other person. Yeah. The question whether Johnson could have closed down the war at the end of '64, I don't think so. He came in with the idea that we can't give in to communism. He knew what happened with Hitler, that we have to fight tyranny, and I don't think so. And Kennedy, I don't think would have withdrawn either. I really don't think he would. Okay, now next, and then 2 people in the front. Yeah. Well, actually, it is being taped, but the question is when it will show up online. But, when it does, I will do that. Okay, and I'm sorry, you had a question. In the second row, the gentleman, didn't you have it? I thought you did. Yes. I do not think he personally was involved in it. It may have been people around him or associates that knew him that may have, but I do not think I don't think of him as being involved in a conspiracy, no. But there are 2 books that are out, 2 different authors separate from each other that claim this. But I mean, they're also, every time a president dies in office, there's always going to be accusations that maybe somebody had something to do with it, even when they die supposedly natural causes. but I would say I do not believe that there's. Well, I haven't gone into depth in those two books to read them. I have to admit. I mean, they're recent, but I would not tend to believe that. No, but I guess you do, and people have different views. If that had been known, he could have been obviously removed from office, impeached, obviously. But the man certainly had his corruption and his scandals in his life. I mean, I don't think there's any question. He's not a clean guy in a full sense. Not that many are, but I would not tend to believe that. Anyway, you had another hand here. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, there was a poll in 2011 of experts supposedly, and this is after only 2 years, and he was rated number 13 at that time, out of 43, I guess, So he was in the bottom of the top third. It's hard to say when you have 2.5 years left because if things go really bad in the last 2.5 years, we can forget about him being that high. If the Affordable Care Act is shown to be a success, he can shoot up. So it's very hard, to say. I certainly would say at the least, even if he fell, he'd be in the top 20, the top half at least, which would not be that high, but be considered average. I do not see him as ever being below average or a failure. I know there are people who hate his guts and think he's the worst president, since whatever, but they've said that about others as well. I think the word worst should be very limited, and I don't think any modern president is the worst. I don't think anywhere near it. I think it's presidents of the distant past that are the worst. But if he does well, depending on how you define well, he could go up to maybe number 11 or 12. I don't see him in the top 10 at this point, but I think somewhere between 11 and 20. But at least from 3 years ago, but that's very early, he was rated number 13. Now, the fact that he has persisted in the Affordable Care Act is used against him, but actually in the long run, it could be for him because it's just like LBJ persisting in what he wanted to do, and also FDR persisting in what he wanted to do, and Wilson persisting. You can't automatically come out and give up on things because you have opposition. And I want to point out a lot of, not so much with LBJ, but a lot with Wilson and even with FDR, a lot of the legislation was accomplished by small margins. They were not always massive margins. Bills become law just as long as you get a majority. So if you ever knew the whole list of important things that have been passed by 1 or 2 votes, it would shock you how long a list it is. So yes, it's been a close vote. And yes, there's strong opposition. But there was strong opposition to Social Security in 1935. There was strong opposition to Medicare in 1965 as examples. And the fact is, they have become permanent. And I do think in some form, with tinkering and with some changes, obviously, the Affordable Care Act is going to be indeed permanent law. And millions of people who have never had health care will have it. And there's other things that he's accomplished as well. I mean, just bring up one issue, but he's actually, I think, a number of things he's accomplished. Some things he hasn't done well, but every president has ups and downs. And it's hard to say with 2.5, almost 3 years to go, about 2 years, 9 months. But I think he's likely to be in the 11 to 20 range. And based on 2011, he's number 13. But that's out of date, obviously, already. Yes? Well, it depends how you define lack of leadership. Every president's accused, if something doesn't go well, of lack of leadership. I actually think his leadership has been quite amazing in the midst of such opposition. He's had such opposition, and he has persisted, and he's never gotten, I don't know what he does in private, he never gets angry. He's calm and cool, and that drives his opponents nuts, that he will not ever get angry. And I think he's a man of courage and guts, and he doesn't think you have to be nasty in public, and he's a gentleman all the time, and I think that's a positive point as I see it. So I think he will look better than he may look to many people at the moment, but that's every president. I mean, it's going to be a long time thing to figure out what his ultimate rank, and actually we're still arguing. Every time there's a new president, everybody gets readjusted as to where they are in the ranking. So that's reality. Okay, any other questions? One more question, okay? Yes. Yes, if it was only domestic, yeah, as she said, if it was only domestic, LBJ would be number 5, but Vietnam, which is a big but, gets in the way. A tremendous but, yes. 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 It was a blunder beyond belief. There's no question about it. So that's why, at the moment, he's rated number 11. But I think the fact he's reached up to 11 after being lower is an accomplishment that it has dimmed a bit the Vietnam War. It doesn't mean it disappeared, but it's dimmed it a bit, where he's moved up to at least be in the top 1/4, I guess, 11 out of 42. So he's in the top fourth. What's that? Well, yes and no. I mean, I have my problems with him, but again, remember, I got a fellowship through his administration. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Hmm. Well, Kennedy had the. Well, after Kennedy, everybody looked bad because Kennedy was so special in his appearance and his oratory and his wife, his kids. Yeah. Yeah. But you're not supposed to judge people by looks alone. Yeah. Yes.